In the small town of Ashwood, Illinois, there was a simple park surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to hold the whispers of forgotten generations. Among them all, one stood out, fallen after a violent storm. Its thick, twisted roots reached out like claws, as if trying to grasp something that should never be released. It was before this tree that Marcus, a boy of just 10, began to stop every day in an enigmatic ritual that intrigued everyone. He always arrived at the same time, just before sunset, when the golden light filtered through the broken branches and transformed the ground into a mosaic of unsettling shadows. While the other children ran, played ball, and filled the air with laughter, Marcus remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the dark space between the exposed roots. It was as if he saw something there no one else could see. At times, his lips moved in inaudible whispers, as if conversing with a hidden presence. At others, his heavy silence was so profound, it seemed to freeze time around him. The adults, unable to ignore the scene, watched from a distance. Some believed it was just a child's fantasy. Others swore something was wrong. Mothers pulled their children away, fearing the habit was a bad omen. The superstitious elders shook their heads, claiming the boy was marked by something beyond logic. Yet Marcus seemed oblivious to it all. He returned day after day, as if obeying an invisible command, as if he were the guardian of a secret that could not be told. But after all, what was it about that fallen tree that captured a boy's attention, and what did he see there that no one else dared to see? Don't miss the next stories that will move you. Subscribe now and leave a like to further strengthen these stories. Ashwood was the kind of town where nothing really seemed to happen, a place of narrow streets, old wooden houses, and a community where everyone knew each other by name. Life there followed a slow pace, marked by the church bell. On Sundays, lingering conversations in the central market, and children who, in the late afternoon, filled the park with laughter and games. To passers-by, Ashwood was just another dot on the map of Illinois, but to its residents, it was a haven of normalcy, a safe space where secrets rarely surfaced. It was in this seemingly peaceful environment that Marcus lived. His silence contrasted with the agitation of the other children, and this soon caught the attention of adults. Teachers at school murmured in meetings that the boy seemed disconnected, as if his mind was always elsewhere. His mother, a woman tired of working 2 jobs, tried to justify his behavior by saying he was simply shy. His father, absent since leaving years before, was a ghost no one mentioned. The neighborhood, however, preferred rumors. Some said Marcus was too strange. Others believed he had inherited some trauma that had never been explained. In the park, there was always someone watching him from afar. Mothers chatted in groups as they watched their children, but when they noticed Marcus standing in front of the fallen tree, they exchanged suspicious glances. Some parents thought it was a phase, something that would pass with time. Local police officers, accustomed to dealing only with petty thefts or bar fights, laughed when anyone mentioned the boy and his obsession. To them, there was nothing more to it than a childish imagination. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Marcus's behavior remained unchanged. He continued to visit the tree with disturbing constancy, as if fulfilling some invisible obligation. His unwavering demeanor began to unsettle even the most skeptical. After all, why would a 10-year-old boy choose to stand before a dead tree every day, saying nothing, playing or moving? Little by little, the whispers became part of the town's routine. Ashwood, accustomed to monotony, began to divide itself between those who ignored the scene and those who, without admitting it, felt a chill at the sight of the boy standing motionless before the exposed roots. The park, once a symbol of joy, began to carry a different atmosphere, as if a hidden presence hovered over it, silent and insistent. And while the adults tried to rationalize the strangeness, Marcus remained faithful to his ritual. Nothing could keep him away. Not the rain, not the cold, not the weight of suspicious gazes. Something invisible seemed to beckon him, and he obeyed with a discipline no one could explain. What no one knew was that this routine wasn't just a child's whim, it was a sign. A silent warning that sooner or later would force everyone in Ashwood to look where they didn't want to. As the days passed, Marcus's behavior ceased to be merely a curious detail and became an event no one could ignore. Every afternoon, punctually, he would stand there before the fallen tree as if he had made a secret pact with that place. Some neighbors began to count the time he spent there. They were always long minutes of absolute silence, interrupted only by small gestures or barely audible murmurs. A woman once swore she heard the boy repeat the same word over and over in a low voice. No one could identify what he was saying, but some claimed it sounded like a name, while others were certain it was just the wind moving through the roots. However, those who approached reported feeling a strange pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere around the tree itself was different from the rest of the park. Marcus, for his part, seemed oblivious to everything. He didn't respond when called. He wasn't bothered by the teasing of the other children who mocked him, or even by the suspicious looks of the adults. His attention remained fixed, as if his eyes could penetrate the earth and see something hidden deep within. Every now and then, he would bend down to touch the ground with his small hands, pressing into the earth as if searching for a hidden beat, an invisible pulse. The teachers began to notice that his notebooks were filled with repetitive drawings, scratched circles, twisted roots, shapes that resembled dark tunnels. Always the same pattern, as if his mind were stuck on a single idea that repeated itself relentlessly. When questioned, he simply lowered his head and remained silent, as if keeping the secret were more important than any answer. The most disturbing thing was his persistence. Not even on days of heavy rain did Marcus stop. Going to the park, his clothes were soaked, his feet were mired in mud. Nothing seemed to distract him from his silent vigil. On the contrary, on those days he became even more immobile, as if the storm strengthened his connection with the fallen tree. It was as if he were waiting for something to happen, as if he were absolutely certain that sooner or later everyone would have to see what he already knew. And although most preferred to look away, the collective discomfort grew. Each new drawing, each new murmur, each repetition of the gesture of pointing to the roots heightened the feeling that there was a truth there, buried and ignored. Until one afternoon, when the wind seemed to blow colder than usual, Marcus didn't just observe. He knelt before the tree, pressed his ear to the ground, and whispered once more. The gesture was so strange that even the most skeptical felt their hearts race. Something was about to reveal itself, and this time it wouldn't just be unusual behavior, but a sign that couldn't be ignored. Over time, the strangeness stopped being confined to Marcus's behavior and began to permeate the very environment surrounding the tree. The park, once so welcoming, began to carry a different weight, as if the exposed roots had opened an invisible crack, allowing something no one could name to escape. The first sign was the smell, a strong, persistent odor, like damp earth mixed with something heavier, something reminiscent of rust or burnt flesh. It was subtle at first, but intensified whenever Marcus approached the tree. Many said it was simply the natural rot of the wood, but others silently admitted they sensed something amiss in that explanation. Then came the sounds. For a few nights, residents living near the park claimed to hear muffled cries, as if a child were calling for help amidst the wind. Some convinced themselves they were just imaginary echoes. Others closed their windows tighter, avoiding even looking in the direction of the trees. Even the animals seemed to sense it. The birds that always perched on the surrounding branches disappeared. Dogs strained at their leashes and refused to go near the fallen tree, barking nervously, as if sensing an invisible threat. It was as if all of nature had organized itself to avoid that place. Despite all this, Marcus was still there. He wasn't intimidated by the smells, the sounds, or the emptiness of the birds. On the contrary, he seemed even more focused, as if each new sign were confirmation of something only he understood. And this was beginning to frighten even those who, until then, had insisted on treating it all as coincidence. Gradually, the general feeling in Ashwood ceased to be curiosity. It became fear. It was no longer just a strange boy in front of a dead tree. It was a growing mystery, an invisible noose that tightened the throats of all who dared get too close. And then, on a windy afternoon, something happened that sealed the collective unease. Marcus, standing motionless before the tree, raised his arm and pointed to the roots, not with the trembling finger of a child, but with the firmness of someone wanting to reveal a hidden secret. Those nearby swore that in that instant the air grew denser, heavier, as if the entire park had stopped to hear a revelation. That simple gesture was enough to transform suspicion into certainty. There was something hidden beneath those roots, and from that moment on, ignoring it would no longer be possible. The growing unrest in Ashwood finally prompted action. It wasn't the police, nor Marcus's parents. The one who took the initiative was a park gardener, a simple man named Henry Collins, known for caring for the trees and wooden benches himself. Henry had spent much of his life there, and for him, everything could be explained by the logic of nature. Perhaps rotting roots, perhaps a dead animal trapped underground. Nothing more. One morning, as Marcus watched the tree with the same blank expression, Henry approached with a shovel in hand. He chuckled lightly, as if trying to diffuse the awkward atmosphere, and muttered aloud that he would fix that mess. A few people passing by the park stopped to watch, curious to see if something would finally be discovered. Marcus, however, didn't laugh. His gaze followed Henry's every move with disturbing intensity, as if he sensed the mistake about to be made. The gardener began to turn the soil superficially, removing dry leaves and broken branches. He dug for a few minutes, finding only pieces of wood and thick roots. He stood up, panting, wiping his sweat, and declared, almost dismissively, that there was nothing there but the obvious. The onlookers nodded, relieved to believe it was all just a figment of the boy's imagination. But Marcus didn't react as expected. His eyes filled with tears, not ordinary sadness, but a suppressed, silent weeping, as if witnessing a betrayal. He lowered his head and remained motionless, letting the tears stream down his face without making a sound. The gesture was so intense that even the most skeptical felt an inexplicable discomfort, as if the boy knew the truth had been ignored once again. Henry, bothered by the boy's reaction, muttered something about kids making up too many stories and walked away carrying his shovel. The small group watching dispersed, muttering among themselves that it had been a waste of time. However, throughout the afternoon, a strange sensation took over. The park. Some said the smell had intensified, others swore they heard even louder noises coming from the roots. Marcus, for his part, didn't return home. He remained standing before the tree until night fell, motionless, like a solitary sentinel standing guard over a secret no one wanted to truly uncover. His silence weighed more heavily than any words, and it was in this contrast between the adult's contempt and the boy's persistence that the inevitable question arose. If that superficial, Excavation revealed nothing. What would happen when someone had the courage to go deeper? The days that followed Henry's failed attempt only reinforced the strangeness in Ashwood. The boy remained there, faithful to his ritual, as if the superficial excavation had meant nothing. Marcus seemed even more focused, and his presence before the tree took on a weight that everyone felt, even if they tried to ignore it. The whispers in the market, the hushed conversations between neighbors, and even the teachers' comments at school all revolved around the same question: what was really happening in that park? It was then that Marcus decided to act differently. On a grey afternoon, with clouds blanketing the city in a heavy, humid hue, he appeared in the park carrying something in his hands. It wasn't a notebook nor a toy. It was an old, worn doll with a broken face and tattered clothes. The sight immediately caught the attention of people who began to gather, curious about the object. Marcus walked firmly to the tree and placed the doll directly in front of its exposed roots. Then he raised his head and, for the first time in a long time, spoke aloud. The words came out clearly, without tremors, like a sentence laden with mystery. "Now you will see." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind seemed to cease, the birds remained silent, and all eyes were fixed on the boy and the doll before the fallen tree. There was something in the intonation of his voice, something in the conviction with which he spoke those words, that sent a shiver down even the most skeptical spine. Some mothers pulled their children away, frightened. Other adults approached, trying to get a better look, as if seeking an immediate explanation for the disturbing scene. But Marcus said nothing more. He simply stood motionless, staring at the tree as he did every day, the doll at his feet like a silent offering. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the town changed. No one could dismiss it as a childish fantasy anymore. Marcus's gesture had transformed its strangeness into a sign impossible to ignore. The smell around the tree seemed stronger, almost unbearable. Some swore they saw movements in the earth, as if something were slowly stirring beneath the roots. And the rumors, which had previously been only whispers, took shape. For many, the doll was just an old object found by chance. For others, it was evidence, a missing link in some story no one wanted to remember. The fact is, after that day, even the local police began paying attention. Reports were filed, statements collected, but no one had the courage to truly dig deeper. Fear now mixed with curiosity, creating an invisible tension that hung over Ashwood. Marcus, however, seemed satisfied. His gaze remained steady, and his silence spoke louder than any speech. He had made it clear that something was there, hidden, waiting to be discovered. What no one knew was that this simple gesture would be just the beginning of a much greater revelation. For if a doll was enough to shatter the peace of the town, what would emerge when someone finally had the courage to go beyond the surface? After the day Marcus placed the doll in front of the fallen tree, the town of Ashwood was never the same. The boy's gesture had transformed suspicion into certainty, and even the most skeptical could no longer contain the nervous laughter with which they usually faced the situation. That park, once a symbol of tranquility, had become the stage for a mystery that cried out for answers. It was then that the local police, pressured by the community's incessant chatter, decided to intervene. Sheriff Douglas Harper, a middle-aged man known for his practical approach, gathered 2 investigators and a few volunteers to begin an official excavation. For many, it was simply a precautionary measure, something to do to calm the spirits. But for others, especially those who had heard the nighttime cries or smelled the unbearable odor coming from the tree, it was the beginning of something much bigger. On the morning scheduled for the investigation, dozens of residents gathered in the park. The air was thick, heavy, as if the city itself was breathing hard. Marcus stood there, silent, watching closely. His posture wasn't one of childish curiosity, but of someone who already knew exactly what was going to happen. It was as if he was just waiting for the adults to finally have the courage to see what he had always seen. The shovels began to pound against the hardened earth. The metallic sound echoed through the trees, mixed with whispered conversations and the rapid beating of nervous hearts. With each inch removed, anticipation grew. The strong smell of damp earth soon intensified, forcing some to retreat with scarves over their faces. But the investigators pressed on, determined, knowing that retreating now would only fuel the rumors. As the digging progressed, Marcus remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the hole forming. He didn't blink, didn't look away. His lips moved only once, but the sound was so low that no one could make out what he was doing. To some of those present, it sounded like he was murmuring a name. To others, it was just a moan. The fact is, his presence made every blow of the shovel more disturbing. At one point, one of the investigators stopped. He'd felt the shovel hit something harder than the earth. Silence fell over the group. Everyone moved closer, trying to peer at what was emerging from beneath the roots. The earth was removed more carefully, revealing first a piece of dark wood, as if part of a box. Murmurs quickly spread. This wasn't just a rotting log. It was something purposefully placed there. Sheriff Harper ordered them to cautiously clear the surrounding area. As the earth was removed, an entire box began to appear, buried among the tree's thick roots. It was ancient, covered in scars and edges weakened by age. The sight of the box was enough to make some residents take a step back, while others leaned in even closer, unable to contain their curiosity. Marcus didn't move. His eyes just narrowed, as if this was the moment he'd been waiting for forever. The box was lifted with difficulty. Its weight wasn't excessive, but there was something about it that seemed to resist being removed. Silence reigned, broken only by the creak of the wood as it was pulled out. The sheriff, his hands steady despite the tension, stood before the object. And when the lid finally began to give way, a chill ran down the spines of everyone present. What could be hidden in that box? Who would have buried it under the tree, and why? The silence that hung over the park was so thick it seemed to weigh heavily on the shoulders of every person present. Everyone held their breath as Sheriff Harper, with steady hands and watchful eyes, slowly removed the lid of the box found beneath the roots of the fallen tree. The wood creaked, brittle, releasing a dark, damp dust that spread through the air. The smell that escaped from within was even more disturbing, a mixture of mold, rust, and something indefinable that made many take a step back. When the lid finally opened, a shiver ran through the crowd. Inside the box were objects that, at first glance, seemed banal, but within that context carried an almost unbearable weight. There were small, carefully folded children's clothes, already worn by time, stained with dirt and moisture that had corroded the fabric. Beside them lay an antique doll, different from the one Marcus had placed before the tree, but equally disturbing. Its porcelain face was creased, and its glass eyes, though motionless, seemed to stare at everyone with a blank, icy expression. But what drew the most attention wasn't the clothes or the doll. Inside the box was also a small, rusty cassette recorder, still with a tape wound around it. The sheriff held the object up in front of those present, and a collective murmur ran through the crowd. No one knew for sure if the recorder still worked, but the mere fact that it was there, stored alongside such personal objects, suggested that its recording might hold the key to a hidden truth. While everyone reacted to the discovery, Marcus remained motionless. His eyes, however, shone with something different, almost as if he already knew what was inside the box. He didn't seem surprised. It simply seemed to confirm what he had always expected. When the sheriff raised the recorder, The boy slowly raised his hand and pointed directly at it without saying a word. That simple gesture was enough to further heighten the tension. Many began to murmur that it was no coincidence, that Marcus truly knew something no one else did. The sheriff, trying to maintain control of the situation, ordered the box taken to the police station where it could be examined safely. But even with the authority in his voice, it was impossible to hide the discomfort in his eyes. The crowd watched the scene in silence. Some wept softly, recalling ancient stories of the city. Others trembled with fear, as if afraid that old secrets would come to light. And in the midst of them all, Marcus stood firm, like the centerpiece of a puzzle finally beginning to unfold. The box's contents were symbolic, but they carried undeniable weight. Children's clothes, a doll, and a tape recorder. Fragments of a life cut short, reminders of something that should never have been buried. It was impossible not to feel that these pieces hinted at a dark history, a tragedy the city had tried to forget. The sheriff carefully packed everything away, but the townspeople's gaze remained fixed on the fallen tree, as if waiting for it to reveal even more. Marcus didn't move until everyone began to disperse. Only then did he walk over to the dug hole, peer inside, and let out a single, brief, enigmatic smile that no one could interpret. And that night, when the entire city seemed immersed in discussions about what they had found, one question echoed in everyone's minds. If the objects inside the box were already so disturbing, what would the recording stored on the tape reveal? At the Ashwood police station, the box discovered beneath the tree's roots rested on a weather-beaten wooden table. Sheriff Harper, accompanied by 2 investigators, surveyed the contents with the tension of someone who knew they were dealing with something larger than they seemed. The children's clothes, the cracked doll, and most importantly, the tape recorder became the focus of attention. This wasn't just a pile of forgotten objects. It was concrete proof of a buried story, a story that someone, at some point, had tried to hide. The recorder was carefully tested. The device was corroded by time, but it still worked. The dim lights flickered, and a hissing sound filled the room, breaking the heavy silence that reigned among the officers. After a few seconds of noise, a child's voice echoed. Faint, muffled by the tape's wear. It was a girl, probably no older than Marcus. Her voice carried a tone of desperation. She cried for help, cried, and repeated someone's name. The sound was so disturbing that even the most experienced officers felt their stomachs turn. After a few moments of crying, a second voice appeared on the recording. Different, firmer, adult. The tone was cold, almost authoritative, trying to calm the girl. But there was something in the cadence of his speech that chilled the blood. It wasn't the tone of someone trying to comfort, it was one of someone trying to control. The tape ended abruptly with a sharp thud, as if it had been hastily turned off. Sheriff Harper, pale, turned off the recorder. The girl's name was unclear, but a detail began to circulate among investigators. 30 years ago, in 1993, a girl named Emily Carter had mysteriously disappeared in Ashwood. She was only 9 years old when she vanished, and the case, poorly investigated at the time, had been shelved without a solution. The town had grown accustomed to living with the shadow of that loss, but now, with the discovery of the box and the recording, everything was coming back to the surface. When the news spread, the town was plunged into shock. Older people remembered the posters with Emily's face plastered across the streets, the searches that yielded nothing, the hushed conversations that someone important had interfered with the investigation. Now, 3 decades later, the memory returned like an open wound. The Carter family, still living in Ashwood, was called to the police station. Emily's elderly mother wept when she saw the clothes removed from the box. She immediately recognized the floral dress and the blue bow that used to tie her daughter's hair. The confirmation was devastating. Those objects truly belonged to the missing girl. The past, previously silenced, now screamed out for all to see. As the community struggled to process the revelation, Marcus seemed increasingly enigmatic. There was no logical explanation for how a 10-year-old boy, born long after Emily's disappearance, would know exactly where to look. How could he pinpoint a secret buried for decades with such precision? Some whispered it was spiritual sensitivity, others believed it was coincidence, but a growing number began to fear that Marcus had an even deeper connection to the tragedy. Emily's case was reopened. Old files began to circulate again, the names of long-forgotten suspects returned to the conversation, and the feeling grew that there was much more to be discovered. Sheriff Harper, under pressure from outside authorities and the media, which was beginning to take an interest in the mystery, knew he could no longer contain the situation. But as they tried to organize evidence and make sense of the inexplicable, Marcus's fixed gaze seemed to carry a warning. He didn't smile, didn't cry, just watched. And each time he approached the fallen tree, his presence seemed to further intensify the surrounding signals, the smell, the nocturnal sounds, the sense that something was still waiting to surface. Because if the recording had already revealed a forgotten tragedy, everyone knew that this was just the beginning. What else might be buried beneath the tree's roots? And most importantly, who in the city was willing to prevent the truth from fully coming to light? The cassette tape's revelation fell upon Ashwood like a bombshell. Emily Carter's name echoed through the streets once again, reminding everyone that the town had never truly gotten over her disappearance. Families who preferred silence were forced to remember. Neighbors who swore they hadn't seen anything 30 years earlier were eyed with suspicion, and the town's once pervasive calm dissolved into murmurs and fear. Under pressure from all sides, Sheriff Harper convened a new investigative team. Old documents were removed from the station's dusty archives. Forgotten witnesses were called to testify, and for the first time in decades, there seemed to be a chance for justice. But Ashwood wasn't just a place of memories, it was also a place of secrets. Some residents began claiming to remember influential figures involved at the time, names that had never been thoroughly investigated. Whispers suggested that someone powerful had used their influence to bury Emily's case, ensuring the truth remained hidden. These rumors rekindled fears that, as in the past, the quest for justice could be stifled before it even got anywhere. However, something was different now. The town wasn't just faced with a memory, there was physical evidence. There was the tape, there was the box, and there was Marcus. The boy had become the center of attention, even against his will. Journalists began to flock to Ashwood, intrigued by the story of the boy who had pointed to the buried secret. Psychologists and curious onlookers discussed his mysterious connection to the case, raising theories ranging from supernatural sensitivity to the inheritance of a collective memory. As the investigation progressed, the mood in Ashwood was divided between hope and fear. Some believed that finally the culprits would be exposed and the town could free itself from the weight of the past. Others feared that stirring up this secret would only bring more pain, and that forces, unseen or all too human, would do everything they could to keep the truth buried. At school, Marcus was watched more than ever. Children avoided him, teachers didn't know how to deal with his silent presence, and parents debated whether it was safe to let their children near him. The boy, however, seemed indifferent to everything. He continued to visit the fallen tree every day, as if the incident around him were just a distant echo. It was as if his connection was directly with what lay beneath the earth, not with the adults trying to decipher it. Then, signs of resistance began. Sheriff Harper noticed that important information was simply disappearing from the files. Reports were disappearing, witnesses were suddenly withdrawing from testimony, and external pressure was mounting on him to handle the case carefully. Harper, who knew the inner workings of the city well, knew he was touching on something dangerous. The townspeople, however, demanded answers. Old wounds had been opened, and there was no longer any way to ignore them. The smell, the sounds, and the strange presence surrounding the tree were now remembered as proof that Ashwood carried a greater burden than he cared to admit. And at the center of it all, Marcus. The boy stood still, ever present, ever watching. It was impossible not to feel he knew more than he was letting on. At that point, the city was divided. Justice seemed within reach, but the shadow of impunity still loomed large. What came next would depend not only on the police or the residents, but on what else might be uncovered beneath those roots. For if they had already found clothes, dolls, and recordings, what else could be buried there, waiting to be discovered? The days following the discovery of the tape and the reopening of Emily Carter's case plunged Ashwood into a suffocating atmosphere of tension. The park, once bustling with laughter and activity, was now avoided by many. Even so, Marcus continued to go there, faithful to the fallen tree, as if obeying an invisible call. That afternoon, the cloud-heavy sky foretold a storm. A cold wind blew through the empty park as the boy walked to the same spot he always did. But there was something different about him. His steps weren't those of a simple observer. They were those of someone preparing to end a cycle. She knelt before the tree and began digging with her small hands, unhurriedly, as if performing a silent ritual. Damp earth oozed through her fingers until a small hole opened. From her worn backpack, she removed the doll she'd left behind weeks earlier and, with almost ceremonial care, placed it inside. Then she covered it again with earth, sealing the gesture as if returning to the earth something that should never have been taken. When he finished, he stood still, staring at the newly covered earth. And then he smiled. It wasn't the childish smile of a boy, but an enigmatic smile filled with a dark satisfaction, as if only he understood the true meaning of that act. Those watching from afar, hidden among trees or windows, swore they would never forget that moment. The wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the park. The silence seemed even deeper, as if the city itself were waiting for a revelation that would never come. Marcus said nothing. He simply left his smile as a final mark, a silent seal of mystery. He turned calmly and walked out of the park without looking back. The fallen tree remained there, holding secrets Ashwood didn't want to face. But the question lingered. Had Marcus closed the story, or merely opened the door to something even more disturbing? The town of Ashwood was never the same after that. The fallen tree remained in the same place, a silent witness to a truth that emerged from its roots and broke the silence of decades. Some residents avoided the park, others approached only for quick glances, as if hoping the earth would reveal even more secrets. But nothing else was found. The only one who remained certain that something remained there was Marcus. The boy never explained anything, never offered words to justify his actions, but his presence before the tree was enough to forever transform the life of that community. Emily Carter's case remained open, but the weight of true justice seemed to slip through the law's fingers. There was evidence, there were rumors, there were memories that returned like ghosts, but there was also the silence of those unwilling to commit. And in this space between revelation and silence, Ashwood plunged into a state of constant vigilance. People began to look at their own homes, at their own families, as if wondering how many secrets were still buried, never revealed. Marcus, in turn, became a near mythical figure. Some saw him as a child, gifted with the ability to hear what no one else could. Others feared him, believing there was something dark about him, as if he carried within him the voices of all those who had been forgotten. His image walking alone through the narrow streets at dusk became a memory that every resident kept with them, a memory laden with unanswered questions. The tree, with its exposed roots, stood as a landmark, a silent reminder that the truth can be hidden for years, but always finds a way to resurface. Marcus's final smile before her echoed in everyone's mind. It wasn't an innocent smile, but a gesture that seemed to carry the certainty that the adult world is never prepared to face what it tries to hide. And so the story ended without truly ending. Emily Carter never returned. The town never regained its peace. And Marcus moved on, leaving behind a mystery that would never be fully solved. Because in the end, the message that remained was clear. When no one listens to a child, the truth finds its own ways to scream, even if it is through the deepest silence. And if this story made you reflect, if it gave you goosebumps and kept you hooked until the very last second, subscribe to our channel now. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories. Share this video with those who also enjoy true and dark mysteries, and leave a comment. Do you believe Marcus really knew, or that there was something even more hidden in that tree?